Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for a panel discussion on the transition to APRN practice. Tonight's forum is in collaboration with VUSN's Alumni Association and its mentoring committee. My name is Joshua Thornsberry, and I'll be the moderator for tonight's conversation. I am joined by an accomplished group of clinical experts. They will be responding to a combination of pre-submitted and live questions. Feel free to use the Q&A box for tonight's presentation. So let's get started. Katie, I want to start with you, and I want to bring up the topic of just the interview process. What was that like for you? And can you just kind of go into some details about that?
So when I initially got my first job as a nurse practitioner, I moved states to a state where I didn't know anybody for my significant other's career. And so I really was applying to jobs and I didn't know the field. And I learned a lot in doing that and interviewing for a lot of different roles about what I wanted and didn't want out of a job. One of the sites that I found to be really helpful in terms of thinking about interviewing in general, it's not healthcare related, but it's called askamanager.org. And it really goes through kind of both sides of the interview process and gives you tips about interviewing people, but also what interviewers are looking for. So some of the questions that I think have been the most helpful for me in interviewing for the positions I've had is asking, what's a day look like? Asking about call expectations. There are some physicians out there that want to take call themselves, and that's wonderful. And that there are others who are really looking for an advanced practitioner to take that off their plate. And that's good to know up front if you're going to be taking a lot of call after hours. I think one of the best questions that I've asked in an interview that's helped me get to know people is what separates a good nurse practitioner from a great nurse practitioner in this role? It really gets to the heart, I think, of what the team who's looking to add you is looking for. And is it somebody who reads a lot of papers? Is it somebody who can see high volume? Is it somebody who can be really independent? I think it's important to ask about what mentorship and what the onboarding process is going to look like. Right now, I work in a pretty narrow subspecialty. And so my onboarding process, it took about 6 months before I was seeing patients independently. And that was really important for me to know on the front end because I'm working in neurodevelopmental pediatrics, and that's not something I got a whole lot of experience with during my clinical rotations. I personally like to ask what kind of ongoing education the physicians that I'm going to be working with do, because it's important to me that I work with clinicians who are going to stay up to date and attend conferences and actively read journal articles. And it also gives me a head start if it's a position I'm going to start, what journals should I be reading up on so that I'm up to date prior to starting. One of my coworkers at work always asks if it's a new position or if it's a backfill position. And I think this is a great question to ask, is it the volume's high and they're adding somebody, or is this the position with really high turnover? Because if people aren't staying there, there's likely a reason why. Some yellow or red flags that I've run into are really wanting the advanced practitioner to take all of the call. They're really just looking for somebody probably to do the grunt work that they don't want to do, and it might not be a role really where you can learn and grow your skills. If there's no onboarding process at all. Even in a family practice, if you can hit the ground running as a family nurse practitioner, you're going to have questions, you're going to have to learn the EHR, you're going to have to learn how that place does paperwork, and if they haven't thought through that, that's good to know on the front end. It's always a bit of a yellow flag when you run into people who only want to hire new graduates, because I think sometimes new graduates are a little bit ripe for being taken advantage of because they're so eager to get started. And so if they're really only hiring new graduates, it may be that the more experienced graduates in the area are savvy and know this isn't the best place to work. And providers who have never worked with an advanced practitioner before, it's just something to be aware of because they might not really understand fully what our role is. And what we're capable of. They might want you to do a lower level of work, but they also might have expectations that are through the roof when you're just getting the ground running. So those are the things I think about when I'm talking to somebody I'm interviewing with.
You make some excellent points. And I think the most valuable takeaway from that is that you are also interviewing them at the same time they're interviewing you. And so you've raised some great points for our attendees to think about asking during their interview process. I want to ask you too, so let's say we get past the interview process and a contract lands in your email or on your desk or whatever. What are some things that you think could be some red flags in that contract that we need to know about?
So being aware of non-compete clauses, they really don't hold up in court, but most people really don't want to fight them, and it can create some issues for you when you're leaving. So if the non-compete clause is, you can't practice anywhere within a very large radius for a very wide variety of specialties, that really would make it difficult for you to leave unless you were willing to move. Having base salary versus incentive pay, it could be quite difficult to earn the incentive pay. So making sure that the base salary is something that you can comfortably live off of and pay your loans off of is pretty important. Taking into account not only just the dollar compensation, but also what are benefits. I have had friends and ex-classmates who've taken jobs that they thought paid really well, but then the part they had to pay for health insurance was very expensive. And so looking at the whole package, understanding, how much vacation time you're going to get, how much CME time, and depending on where you practice, who the supervising physician or collaborating physician is going to be and what kind of a relationship you're going to have with them. Are they just going to be signing off on everything, or are they going to be expected to mentor you? And just knowing what you're looking for and making sure that it aligns.
Perfect. Thank you, Katie. I want to bring Ecom into this conversation. So yeah, there are these contracts, but there's a lot of things that really can be negotiated in those contracts. Ecom, can you share on that?
Yeah, so I, as a new grad, was very intent on staying in Nashville. And so I received my first contract, had it reviewed by a lawyer. And so that person went through line by line and pointed out some red flags or some difficulties that might, some things that might cause difficulties later on. It was expensive. It was about $500. So as a student, that's another expense that was a little bit hard to swallow, but it was well worth it to know what to look for in the future. But also just looking after doing that review and then being able to turn around and say, hey, these are some things that I would like to propose to change. If you come across a practice that is unwilling to modify things or be reasonable, find middle ground, that's probably the start of not a great relationship. I'm not saying that they have to say everything or agree to everything that you put on the table, but at least being amenable to some things, to give and take, especially when it comes to experience that you bring that might be unique to the practice, when it comes to CME, when it comes to reimbursement, things like that. Those smaller ticket items that they probably are able to compensate for.
And just kind of in that line, do you feel, or can you speak about just a new graduate having some bargaining power in those conversations?
Yeah, so I mean, definitely going into that negotiation, using tools, whether they're online, whether it's connecting with other nurse practitioners in the area, knowing what the going salary is, knowing what hours are typically worked within the area. I mean, that could be different for a lot of different reasons, but this is what I know to be the going rate, or this is what I know to be the schedule for most nurse practitioners working within the specialty. And because of that, I would like to ask, fill in the blank. So you're not just presenting and saying, I would like what you're having. I mean, even if you go online and say, this is what I've found to be, whatever it is, you have some basis to put your request upon. It's not just flimsy laying there.
Yeah. The job is out there because they need somebody to work. They need somebody to fill that role. And I know when I went through that process, I was nervous to ask for more, but I did at kind of the nudging of a mentor, and they gave me more, and so it can be done.
That's a great point. Yeah. There was a situation, I had already gotten the job, which was great, but came time to for bonuses. They unexpectedly gave us a bonus, which was great. But we did also find out that the compensation offered to nurse practitioners versus physicians was considerably different. And so for us as a group of nurse practitioners to write a formal letter and then submit that and say, hey, you know, we are working these hours, we are seeing these patients, we are equal in every other way, and because of that, we are asking for this. If you don't ask, you will never have a yes. But if you do ask, at least you can say, I put forth effort, I've asked, and then it's been, you know, they said yes or they said no. That's what's the worst they can say. No.
That's great advice. That's great advice. And just about, you know, it doesn't stop at that first negotiation. Can you speak a little bit about, like, you know, being 6 months in, a year in, and really going back to those same people and saying, okay, maybe I need more now?
Yeah. Definitely. So as you're gaining more experience, as you're gaining more skills, if you gain more certifications, taking tests, things like that, anything that pushes you further, that you're able to offer more to your patient population, absolutely. You don't have to wait for your contract to come to renewal. You know, hey, I'd like to talk about you know, my recent certification and what that means for our patients and what I would like to be able to offer. And in doing so, I would like to, and then fill in the blank there.
Awesome. You know, to kind of really tie up this whole interview topic, and this is kind of open to everyone. I'll bring Katie back into the conversation as well, about that first year, like kind of mentorship and fellowship. You know, we consider our first year really a fellowship, whether they officially call it that or not. Can you kind of speak about that process and really how you identify, if it's not a formal mentorship, how do you identify someone to kind of fill that role for you?
I think you can't be afraid to ask. You know, there are going to be, in most places where people are going to be taking jobs, they're going to be more experienced physician assistants. And I say that because I work with a lot of PAs, nurse practitioners or physicians. And most people in these roles really do enjoy teaching. And I think if you are a naturally curious people, as I'm sure that most of the Vanderbilt nursing students are, people are going to really enjoy mentoring you. So it doesn't have to be an official relationship, but just finding the right time to ask people the right questions, and not being afraid to knock on doors, because everybody's been new, everybody's been in those shoes, and nobody likes feeling like they have nobody to go to. So everyone really, now that I'm on the other end and I'm answering a lot of those questions, it really is a fun position to be in. So just not being nervous about it, I think, is the main thing.
Awesome. Well, thank you. Let's kind of change gears here. And so let's talk about credentialing. So let's say we've accepted the job and we kind of move into this. All right, we're gearing up to start working, but there's a lot of things that still have to be done. So Ashley, I want to bring you into this conversation. So let's just start with just a couple things here. DEA, what is it? Do I need one? How much does it cost?
So your DEA license is needed to prescribe controlled substances. It costs $888, very expensive. But thankfully my job reimburses us for the cost. But yes, you do need your DEA. And that was one of the unexpected expenses that comes with being a nurse practitioner. And also, you know, with your certification boards for women's health nurse practitioners, the NCC, it costs $325. Then if you go through the process of getting the certification review, I did the Fitzgerald, it cost $375. And thankfully I passed my boards and then went on to apply for my APRN license. That was free through the state of Tennessee, thankfully. And your MPI number, that's free. I will say with the MPI number, one thing I wish somebody would have told me is probably to wait until you have a job, because once you fill out your personal information with your cell phone number and your home address, if you don't have a job, that information is out there for the world to see. Like, I want to say a couple of months ago, I realized that once I typed in my first name and last name and my credentials, there was my cell phone number and my home address. So I had to go through the process of emailing these third-party websites, asking them, hey, please take my personal information down. This is a safety concern. So.
Yeah, that's a great point. Our safety as a provider is paramount, and there's a lot of information that gets posted about us online. So yeah, you make a good point. Are a lot of those things that you talked about that cost you a lot of money, did your employer reimburse you for those things?
So my employer, they only reimbursed me for the DEA license, but some other things that they're reimbursing me for, which is definitely something that the new grads and just nurse practitioners in general should ask for in their negotiations, are reimbursement for like APRN license renewal fees, malpractice liability insurance, fees for joining professional organizations. Like I just joined ACOG and MPWH, and also different trainings. So I have to take a fetal monitoring course, and there's like a whole textbook you have to buy for the class. And my job is reimbursing me for the textbook. And also like subscriptions like Up to Date and Micromedics. So those are some great things to be reimbursed for.
Awesome. And one of the questions that's actually coming in right now is, it says, are new certified practitioners able to negotiate the cost of things like the DEA and other fees, like during their, like kind of that negotiation process?
So with me, since my job reimbursed me for the full amount, which is $888, I really didn't run into any problems saying, hey, can you pay this or that? They just said, whatever you pay for, we'll reimburse you for it. So that's something that you definitely can ask for, but I didn't run into any problems with them only wanting to pay a certain portion of my DEA license. They were willing to pay the full amount.
So one piece of the whole credentialing process that does get a little confusing is really kind of being set up to bill insurances. Is that something that you have experience with Medicare, Medicaid, all the different private insurances?
So we have a great staff at my job that did literally everything for me with the credentialing paperwork. They had little sticky notes like sign here, fill this out. You don't have to fill this out. So pretty much I'm a new grad NP, so I just started working at my job like back in July. So a lot of this stuff, I'm like, I'm not sure, but I know that they got the ball rolling. The staff at my job, the credentialing staff, when I was signing all the paperwork, it seemed like about 60 to 100 pages of paperwork just to be credentialed and get privileges and be able to be paid by insurance. So I think that was something that was handled by the staff.
Awesome. And it's great that you have those resources at your employer. I'm wondering if any of the other panelists kind of had to navigate that process on their own, and if they could speak to what that actually was like.
I work at a small clinic, so we had someone initially set up our credentialing, and so when I started, it was really similar to Ashley. I just had to sign where she put little sticky notes and make sure everything was spelled right. But now that I'm a few years in, whenever I update my license, or this year I had to update my DEA, there's an online profile that insurances pull my information from to keep my credentialing with insurance up to date. And so I had to go on personally and make sure all my updated information was there and my updated license. But it's fairly user-friendly because it was all initially set up by someone else. But I think one of the other newer providers in my clinic did set up her own profile for that. And I think it was a little intimidating at first, but once you kind of dig through all the information, it's fairly user-friendly still, even if you have to set it up by yourself. So
I agree. Yeah, recently our employer has done, really put our reappointments online. And so we're kind of in charge of that now. So it's an electronic process, but it's still a user-friendly process. And I think it's important to know your state laws and know what it is that is required in your state. And that kind of goes back to another thing I wanted to ask you, Ashley, is, what is the best way to communicate with your state board? And, what licenses did you need from a state level to really practice?
So in communicating with the state board, I found email to be very useful. When I was filling out the APRN license application and they wanted an official copy stating that I passed my certification boards. They had an email for someone down at the Tennessee Board of Nursing. And that's the person that let me know, hey, your APRN license is ready. So I found email to be very beneficial. And what was the other question?
So one piece of it is what licenses did you actually have to practice in the state?
You had to have your APRN license. They also do ask about your RN license, and you also have to pass your certification exam.
Okay. And I don't know if any of the panelists can speak to this. I know when I moved from Tennessee to Georgia, I had to apply for a whole new licensure. So can anyone speak to the process of changing states, compact licenses, you know, what you do and how you navigate that?
I can speak a little on that. So when I moved from Tennessee back to Indiana, at the time, Indiana was not a compact state. So I had to obtain my RN license through, I've forgotten what the term is, but I had to show that I was licensed in another state. They went ahead and issued my RN license. Then I applied for the APRN. And then after that, I had to also apply for a CSR, or controlled substance, in addition to having my DEA. So it was a good 6, almost 8 weeks process to get everything. It was a domino effect.
I've applied for licensure just because we've been uncertain where we're going to live a few times. So I've always applied kind of preemptively, and I found that to be a good, if you have the money to do that and are in a position. Because I didn't know where we were going to live, I applied in Ohio, in Michigan, and in Missouri, kind of the states we were looking at. And it did help when I was applying for jobs that was already in process, because for many of these states, it's a lengthy process. And if they're looking at a lot of applicants, the fact that you're kind of already started that and could potentially start sooner was helpful.
And is it helpful to really kind of spell out that on your CV and resume, what you did with those licenses, why they're not active?
Yes. And usually the clinical team you're working with doesn't care. It's HR that does if you're applying to a larger organization, but HR does very much control the flow of CVs. So it's nice to spell things out for them.
Yeah. And I found through the whole credentialing process and, you know, the hiring process, you have to explain everything. So everything you have done up until the point you get to start that job, they want you to explain. So just make sure you keep good records. Sure. Well, thank you so much for, oh, sorry, Lydia.
Oh, the point that Ashley made about email is another great thing for records. So I will definitely say that email in South Carolina was not typically the most efficient way to get the nursing board to work with you. It tended to be part of a pretty significant backlog. So if you had something that was in a timely manner, you needed to call or just drive yourself there. So that definitely had to happen for me and many of my other colleagues at different points. But email is definitely good because you have records of contacting people. Now, since being in Georgia, I have not found that to be the same kind of point of desperation. People have been a little bit better to do email or phone. But, you know, don't hesitate. If it's something where it's like, I need to start working, if a quick drive over to the state capitol gets it going, then go for it.
Did you find that process intimidating, talking to your state board, or did you find them helpful, extremely helpful?
I have found Georgia to be much more helpful than South Carolina. So South Carolina, when I started, I was on the compact license from Tennessee. So that I did get the license over there through endorsement, but I had to have the APRN license, and then you apply for your prescriptive authority separately. So you have to apply for that as like a little addendum on your APRN license. And then you had to get a state controlled substance as well as your DEA. So there were a lot of little nuanced steps that from the outside, you know, moving there, I hadn't quite had that clarified to me. So once kind of getting in the process, and of course, pulling the teeth to find the details, it's worth doing, but it was definitely something where as a new grad, it was a little bit tedious.
Yeah. Well, thank you everyone for your advice. We're going to transition now to a topic that, you know, really, I don't I didn't know, I didn't hear this term in imposter syndrome. I didn't know what it was. I experienced it, but I didn't have a label for it. So, Darcy, I want to bring you into this conversation, and I just want you to explain what imposter syndrome is and how we really overcome that.
Yeah, so I learned this week you're not alone in that feeling, because I talked to some of my coworkers about speaking on this panel, and they were all like, what is imposter syndrome? And then I explained it, and they were like, oh yeah, okay, yeah. So I think a lot of people experience this. It's kind of the feeling that you're not qualified, or you don't know what you're doing, or you're not the right person for the job. And I think we all struggle with that, especially when you first start. And I think the reason it's you're an imposter is because you feel like you don't belong, but it's not correct, because you have the training, you have the knowledge. It's just learning how to use it. And so I think that comes with experience. And we've kind of throughout this panel talked about mentorship. And I think that's a big part of this too. I think my clinic is very small. It's actually nurse practitioner owned. And so when I started, I felt like I had really big shoes to step into, because everyone else was really experienced. They'd been in pediatrics, which is where I work in, for a long time. And so, day to day, sometimes you interact with patients or parents of patients, and they have questions you don't necessarily know the answer to. And so part of what you have to learn is how to be confident in what you know. But I think also part of it is knowing what you don't know. And being comfortable asking. Like Katie said, you can't be afraid to knock on someone's door or call someone and ask. And, in my experience, I've never had someone say, well, you should know that. It's always people are willing to help, because ultimately the goal is good patient care. And so if your question is coming from a place of, I just want to take good care of my patients, then, it's a fair question, and it's important, because you don't want to do the wrong thing because you just weren't sure and you were afraid to ask. And so in my experience, I think having good relationships with coworkers, asking questions is always a good thing, and helps you get where you need to go. And I also think patients respect asking for a second opinion from someone else if you're not quite sure. And, I think we all think everyone expects you to have all the answers, and you really don't have to have all the answers. And I think in school, oh, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, most of us are in, some type of specialty, and we don't have all the answers. If I get asked about something about diabetes, it's okay to be honest that I'm not up to date on all the new medications, but we'll get somebody in here that knows, what to say to the patient. But
yes,
I want to bring Sarah into that conversation, if you're okay with Sarah. Did you experience imposter syndrome in your first year, and how did you overcome that?
Like everybody said, I think definitely you do go in as a new grad to anything, whether it's, nursing, advanced practice, nursing, teaching, really anything. You're like, am I cut out for this? Did I really just graduate? What did I just learn? It's just such a blur that you go in really questioning yourself. But to everyone's point, kind of overcoming that, I really relied on people I had done clinicals with. So people that I followed, I stayed close with them, I'm so sorry, my cat, I'm so sorry. Cat is, he's a bad cat. So I stayed in close contact with everyone that I did clinicals with. My specialty, I was actually a psychiatric nurse prior to becoming a psychiatric nurse practitioner. So the hospital that I worked at as an RN kept those contacts. I had physicians' phone numbers. So anytime I felt, kind of in the wrong place, I just reminded myself that I'm so sorry, that I was surrounded by people that could help me and meet my full potential. And I think that's how I really overcame it, was to rely on everyone I knew. And then also, I think it was maybe Darcy mentioned, or maybe it was Ashley with credentialing, things like up to date, right? I mean, there is nothing wrong with saying, I still look things up. I graduated in 2014. And every now and then I have a question. I'm like, I question myself, and I will look up things about Zoloft. I've prescribed Zoloft 1,000 times by now, but I'm like, just so if it, and I don't think it's necessarily imposter syndrome to question yourself every now and then and say, let me look that up. So really having resources like UpToDate, or like for psych, it's, STAL or NEI or whatever it may be for your specialty. That's, those things have been really important for me.
Yeah. And I think that the big take home point that I just heard from you is that you overcome imposter syndrome, and you get through that really tough time where you don't feel like you belong. Darcy, I want to just, you touched on it briefly, but can you talk a little bit more about the importance of networking, not only with people inside of the group that you're working with, but also other people outside, in other specialties, whether this is from an inpatient or an outpatient perspective, how important that is and how you can kind of leverage that?
Yeah, so I work in primary care, so we do a lot of referrals to specialists. And so some of that, is knowing how soon a patient has to get in, or trying to decide what to do in the meantime, because usually you don't see a specialist the next day. And so there are times where you want to call that office and say, hey, can I talk to Dr. So-and-so's nurse or one of the nurse practitioners, or and just touch base and see what they think about this patient. And I moved from out of state, so I'm not familiar with the area I work in. So I honestly don't know a lot of these individuals personally, but because we all see these same patients, there's a level of camaraderie, and it's really easy to call and talk to them and say, hey, we have a mutual patient and I wanted to see what you thought about this and see if you agree with my plan. And honestly, it's really intimidating at first, but once you've done it a few times, I've really never had a bad experience with talking to another provider about a patient. And ultimately it makes the patient feel safer because they feel like you're in contact with the other people that care for them. And then there's also been times where people have been really awesome about getting a patient in the next day, which is really difficult to do sometimes. And so it's really helpful, especially in primary care, when you don't have all the answers and there's someone else that could really help that patient a lot. And so it's really helpful. And it's something like you said, you get over being afraid of doing these things, and it helps with collaborative practice.
Yeah, I agree. It's important to take ownership of your role, I think. And just when you meet a new provider in a different specialty, exchange numbers, tell them who you are, what you do, find out what they do. And that way you always have that link back to them. And, I find we talked about this previously as we were planning this meeting. We're all here to help each other. And sometimes we do a really bad job of just asking for help. And so we're all providers. We all want to achieve the same thing, and that's to help our patients. So yeah, you make a great point about networking, Darcy. I think it's so important. Does anyone else have any comments about that, or did they run into any problems with like a specialist, and how you overcome, a specialist that maybe doesn't want to help an advanced practice nurse?
I think for me, usually when I do call stating this is what I know, or this is what I have seen in practice, and I wanted to make sure that there's not anything extra, or if I'm on the right path. So always putting your best foot forward, stating what you know, and then your question. If you kind of come and you're asking the question, it might seem as though you're not experienced or you're not sure. And oftentimes the response has been a little off-putting. Sometimes you feel like you're being spoken down to, but if you come with some bit of knowledge, then it seems as though, okay, there's some, they feel a little bit more confident in your abilities and treat you as such.
And I know Sarah brought up UpToDate, I think, or maybe she referenced someone else that brought up that resource. There was a question in the chat box. Are subscriptions like that something that you expect your employer to provide for you, especially those who don't work in big health systems that have all these resources available?
Yeah. So for me, I have negotiated that before, and I work at a community mental health center in like rural Tennessee, and so everything is up for negotiation in my point of view. When I'm going to a job or an interview or a contract, malpractice, up to date, anything. So if there's something that you want, like Ecom said, if you don't ask for it, you're never going to get a yes. So I think it's absolutely something you could ask for and negotiate, or CME, whether it's X amount of money a year plus these days off to go to whatever conference once a year. I think everything's on the table. They've been asked for it before, whether they give it or not. You don't know unless you ask. Another thing I have done is buddy up with someone to split the cost of something that I wanted. Share the same password, right? Collaboration, right? So we're collaborating, but that's, it's a good way to share the cost of something that can be very expensive, especially for a new graduate. We talked about all the expenses that come right at the front when you haven't yet gotten a first paycheck. So that's something that I've done, is buddy up with someone to split the cost of a expense of something like Up to Date.
And something we've done in my clinic is, instead of getting us like a silly lunch or something for NP week, we'll say, hey, we all want a copy of this new textbook that can you give that to us? That would actually be helpful, instead of spending your money doing something else to recognize us. I've gone to the physicians themselves.
Yeah. Do any of your employers, this is for all the panelists, that give you, continuing education monies each year, are you allowed to use those things for things like Up to Date or textbooks? Is that something that you could also utilize?
We've been able to use it at our discretion. They just want a receipt. So it has to obviously do with, my specific specialty. But they've really never questioned anything, whether it's been an actual conference or a textbook or an online resource, as long as I could say why this is important to my practice and my patients, and the clinic as a whole, and provide a receipt, then there's really been no issue.
And I'm an avid up-to-date user as well. And I know that, I look stuff up all the time because, like Sarah said, I don't trust my brain. My brain tells me one thing, but I'm not sure if I should trust it. But I know a lot of times, each time you look something up, an article in Up-to-Date, you get continuing education units. And so it's kind of a 2-for-1, right? You get all this information, but also you get the benefit of being able to use those CE units. So really leveraging your CME monies to benefit you.
And not only are they good units, but they are all together in a single list, which is really easy to use when you're reapplying for your next round of boards. Just to say, I can just print this off and submit it.
Yeah, that's a great point. Well, kind of in our last segment, I want to transition to Lydia and Sarah. I want to bring you both into this conversation about the physical and the mental balance of this transition, because there's a lot of things that's going on physically and mentally. So let's talk through that. Lydia, do you want to give us a start, or Sarah?
Yeah, Lydia, please.
Sure. So I feel like we've touched on a lot of things that clearly lead into the obvious reason why we have to focus on mental and physical balance. So I think talking about, building your network, getting to know your community, your colleagues, knowing who your people that you can go to for questions, at any point, and knowing who might make that a little bit more of a challenge is definitely something that everyone has to navigate that first year. And so I know we've all had great experiences finding great people to help mentor us, but I bet most of us have also had experiences where we've had some challenges interpersonally. I've definitely had some physicians that I've loved working with, but really felt like they just had to prove something a lot. And I'll definitely say I value the experience I've had from that, because it made me learn my practice faster. So it was definitely a more intense experience that first year. So really focusing on having that balance was really important to make sure that I wasn't letting those kinds of experiences turn into a negative dialogue in my brain that kind of fueled that imposter syndrome or made any of that discomfort worse when you are a new provider. So I think boundary setting is one of the most important things that I found. I would definitely say that if you're giving everything 110% when you're in the office, and then I'm a midwife and a family nurse practitioner, so I'm taking call in the hospital too. And if you're completely overscheduled, then that's going to give you burnout faster. So, looking at your schedule ahead of time, particularly if you're taking call, and kind of figuring out if there's times that you do need to take some time off when you're having PTO time that you're accumulating, use it, make sure that it's not just getting stored up forever. And it can definitely be a challenge depending on how your practice structure is. You may need to have to meet up with your colleagues and say, these are times that I'm going to trade, or these are times that we're going to help cover each other. But using your community and communicating with them on your needs as far as those boundaries is really good to make sure everybody's doing well and not feeling like they're getting pushed toward burnout. So I would definitely say that's a big part of getting settled. Well, and I think the other stuff is exercise, see sunlight, talk to your friends, have a community. All the normal stuff that got you through midwifery school or family nurse practitioner program or any grad program.
Well, thank you, Lydia. Sarah, I want to bring you into this conversation as well, because I want to specifically spotlight kind of that mental preparation or transition that happens when you take on full responsibility for your patients. Can you discuss that a little bit?
So I think, Lydia, my favorite word is boundary. So boundaries, right? For me, there was maybe a 4-month gap from, I graduated July or August, I believe, and then I was working in December. So that time in between is very, very important, or was important to me. I took time to obviously study and take my boards to see who I wanted to work with, interview. To Katie's point, the interview process with that is very important to mentally prepare. So once you interview with someone, you know what they're expecting. And so if that's not what you want for yourself, then that, that mentally, what you want for yourself, what your boundaries are, what's important in your work-life balance. So really taking the time to, you can write it out or just kind of have a mental list of what's really going to be important to you. That was one of the best things that I did for myself to kind of mentally prepare. Okay, I'm actually going to walk in and take care of people now kind of on my own. I had a small onboarding process, and we're in Tennessee. We have supervising physicians. So I had, people that I could go to, kind of, mentors in where I was working. But one good thing is you can ask what you're going to be expected to do immediately. Are you going to have, are you going to schedule me with 30 patients on my first day, or are you going to allow a caseload to build? So asking those questions will allow you to mentally prepare yourself for what you're walking into. So just ask and then have those boundaries, and more than you think So when you get in there and when you walk in there the first day, again, like Josh and I said, I'm like, I know that, but do I really know that? And I think that happened on my first day, and it will happen the day I retire. But I am always surprised at actually, Sarah, I did know that. You did, right? So way more than you think So just remind yourself of that when you're mentally preparing to take on this new role.
Great advice. Great advice.
And I think kind of in a similar or a segue from that is trust your gut on things. So if you feel, professionally that something's not right or it's not working for you, spend some time with that feeling and kind of reflect on it. So my first job, I was hired, and I had been a student at that site before. And I had a really great idea of how the practice flow was. So I was very lucky that I got to have early exposure to what I would be expected to do. So I joined a practice that had 5 midwives. And within 4 months of being hired, a midwife passed away. A midwife had to stop doing call because her metastatic breast cancer came back. And then another midwife broke her hand. And so that was a time when we all said, we need to get together. We need to work as a group and set new boundaries. And if it had been an organization that we couldn't talk to our supervisor, couldn't talk to HR, couldn't talk to each other, then that definitely would have been a time of just collapse because it was so much change. But we were definitely able to say, like, okay, this is different, but we need to make a new plan. We can't continue to operate with our schedules as we had originally planned, but we also can't cover all of this call just as an extra.
Right. Well, it's good that you were able to navigate through that difficult time and come up with a solution. Kind of on the flip side of that, Lydia, can you kind of speak on when and how to really step away from an unhealthy workplace? There's so much emphasis on your first year. I've heard it said, go get 1 year of experience and you can go be whatever you want to be. But sometimes that first year may not be healthy. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So I think in that situation, that was a prime setup for a personal failing, is what it would have felt like if we hadn't been able to have those new boundaries. So if we had just said, all we have to do is just work more hours and work harder and just commit more when we were already giving 100%, that would be an unsafe work environment. If you're being asked to practice when you are sleep deprived to the point where your fine motor skills are impacted, where you can't make good clinical judgments, then that is not something that should be maintained. And if you go to your supervisor and you let them know, I'm concerned because I'm not able to maintain my personal life outside of this, and I'm concerned about safety, and they don't have a plan to say, I take this very seriously, then that might be a job where it wouldn't be right to stay for the first year. Because the last thing you want as a new grad is to end up in a situation where you don't have good backup, or you're being asked to do something where you feel unsafe. So I would definitely say, no one wants to leave that first job, but there are definitely times where that would be appropriate.
Thank you. Thank you. Ashley, I want to bring you into this conversation as well, because you're kind of new in your role, I believe. So that first year, it's full of mistakes, and it's mostly honest mistakes. How have you been able to bounce back from those mistakes and kind of redirect yourself towards the positive again?
So I'm still in orientation, phase.
Oh, okay. I missed that.
Yeah, so I won't be out of orientation until in about 2 weeks. So I'm still in the orientation phase. Somebody's still holding my hand. So just kind of learning from them different things and kind of formulating the way that I would want to practice, just taking bits and pieces from all the different nurse practitioners and doctors that I've been with, and kind of just formulating my own style and how I want to take care of my patients. But still in orientation, still
It's good to have your perspective, though, because you are right in the thick of it. And
right.
So, you can speak honestly and openly about everything that we've talked about tonight. So, Sarah, I kind of direct that same question to you. Mistakes happen, and how have you been able to bounce back from that in working?
So I own my mistakes. So if it's a small mistake, I forgot to call your medicine in, I meant to increase that and I didn't. And the patient is like, oh, I'll just own it. And that way I'm not dodging it. I'm not lying. I'm not pushing it under the rug. I say, I apologize. That was on me. And then I learn from that, right? We always learn from our mistakes. I can think of a large mistake that was literally an accidental click of a mouse that could have ended very poorly for a patient. And that type of mistake, it kind of scares you enough that you're going to be very cautious with things moving forward. Not that you're not cautious before, but that just kind of lets you know that people's lives are in your hands. So you're going to make mistakes, but when you do, you learn from them and you remember them and then you slow down. So if you find, like Lydia said, if you're being asked to work to the point of making mistakes, not being cognitively really as sharp as you could be, then go to administration, own those mistakes, but say, I need help bouncing back from these because they're, it's too much. So if it's because it's too much, ask for help, go to your administration. But I think also give yourself some grace. First year, 10th year, 20th year, you will make mistakes. Anything, you can also just dive into what you feel like you need to know a little bit more about. Was that mistake because it's something I need to read up, I need to refresh on, or is that a mistake because I clicked the button wrong? What was it? And what route do I take from there, right? Is it because I need to freshen up on stuff, or is it because I need to slow down or ask for some help?
Yeah. Well, thank you. Darcy, I want to start with you as we kind of wrap things up. Would you share just briefly your personal story about when all of this just clicked and it just made sense and you found your stride?
Yeah. So honestly, I think those moments happen more and more. I feel like the more you do what you do, you just have those moments of patience where they're really appreciative of something you've done or how you've cared for them. I think the biggest thing that comes to mind is I had a patient that was a 33-weeker that the hospital actually missed something really large on and discharged her without sending her to a NICU. And so she was in my office in rural Oklahoma, not in a NICU somewhere. And so that involved calling specialists, calling the hospital, asking for help and figuring out what to do. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I was like, wow, I just got that baby admitted to the NICU from my clinic in rural Oklahoma. And, turns out that was where she needed to be. There was a lot going on. And I think ultimately I was like, I'm going to pat myself on the back because I figured things out and got stuff done and had to talk to a lot of really important people. And it was kind of scary, but it worked out. And it made me feel like, I do know what I'm doing. So that's my story, but there's a lot of stories like that for everyone, I'm sure.
That's a great story. And it goes back to what Sarah said. We know more than we think we know. And so that's awesome. That is so great that you were able to make a difference. Ecom, I want to pull you back into the conversation. I want to try to get through a couple of the pre-submitted questions. An important question, even though we are talking to new students transitioning into APRN practice, there's been a lot of talk about full practice authority, and a lot more states are getting full practice authority. What are your thoughts about full practice authority and really how that fits into a new APRN coming into practice?
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, I'm for it. I think that as a group, we have to be very cognizant and aware of what all that entails responsibility-wise. But also, I think we are our best advocates, and nurse practitioners across the country have been lobbying for this right across the country. And so there are several states that have full practice authority for nurse practitioners, and many that are on the verge of that happening and being a reality. And so, like I said, I think that if we go into it, wide-eyed and knowing, this is what we're taking on, and and not being fazed by the opposition that is going to come from a lot of different angles. If we're prepared for that, I think that we can be successful, and we are more than capable of providing the same level of care as our physician colleagues, our PA colleagues. We are high caliber providers.
Absolutely. Excellent points. Excellent points. Katie, I want to direct a question to you from the chat box here. How does RVU work really kind of differ from the salary work, and what's preferred over the other? Can you kind of speak on the difference between the two?
I might not be the best person to answer this because I've always been salaried. So if anyone else has ever worked on RVUs, I'd be happy to punt this question.
Has any of our panelists worked on an RVU basis?
What does that stand for?
That's a great question.
It's revenue.
Essentially, you're getting paid per. I can do the best I can because I know some about it. You're getting paid kind of for the volume you see, but also what type of billing you do. So it's working on salary that you're guaranteed no matter if all your patients no-show you in a day, or you don't have to do as much, as many high-level visits. You're going to get the same amount. RVUs are really based on the volume, what you're billing. I can see that it would really depend on what specialty you're in. I think having the salary is really nice, especially when you're starting out with your student loans and don't have a lot of savings to have that guarantee. But I also can see how working on RVU, when I get overbooked with patients and I'm seeing a full-time load and I'm a part-time provider, sometimes I do wish I were being paid extra for it, because I think that it can prevent burnout if you're getting a little bit extra at the end of the month that you can use to pay down debt or to hire a cleaning lady if you need to, if you're working so much. But I think just kind of figuring out what that's actually going to look like in terms of your paycheck is important.
Right. And this ties into one of the pre-submitted questions, and just rapid fire across the panel. How many patients do you guys see a day?
15 max for me.
15 to 20.
12 to 20.
4 to 5, but my appointments are very different. My appointments are an hour minimum up to 2.5 hours.
Awesome.
25 to 28.
Oh, goodness, Lydia.
I'm about 20.
One of the questions that came in was, would any of you consider going back to school for DNP, and why?
I'm actually thinking about this right now. So I'm a family nurse practitioner, but I ended up in this really niche subspecialty where I'm seeing entirely pediatrics, and I can prescribe psychotropic medicines. I feel like I'm very comfortably practicing within my scope of practice, but I would love to have a psych NP, because sometimes we have had a psych NP in the clinic before, and she was really helpful for older kids who were developing comorbid mood disorders. And I would really like to be helpful for those patients. And right now we're having to get our psychiatry colleagues involved, and I could see a role for that.
Would anyone else like to weigh in on that question?
I might have a less popular answer. Is I've not really thought about doing that because, salary wise in my area, there's no difference. If you were to get another specialty, then that necessarily it doesn't necessarily have to be even a DNP. So, but to go back, the student loans, the time away from practice and from family and those boundaries that I love, it's just not necessarily worth it to me in this moment. That might change in the future, but in this moment, I'm happy where I am. I've been there for 7 years, and my work-life balance is good. So I just don't see necessarily a need personally to do that.
Well, we're almost out of time, and I feel like we could just keep going on tonight. This has been so beneficial and valuable, I feel. But I think that's all the time that we have. And so I want to thank each of you, all of our panelists, for an engaging conversation tonight that I hope has been beneficial for all of our attendees. And for everyone that's been here tonight, thank you for attending. And I just want to say, have a wonderful evening, and be on the lookout for other discussions like this, because our Alumni Association and VUSN, we love hosting these things, and I feel like it's adding value. So come back and join us for another conversation. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, bye, guys.
Bye-bye.